Hello again, I'm Dan Ward, Silver Level Pro from Catskill, New York, and this is the second part of Constructed Accumulated Knowledge. In this episode, I'm going to be going over why I chose my deck, what kind of led me to get to the road that I'm at right now, going over the metagame, both in real life and online, and how that affects the choices in my sideboard and my main deck that I'm making, as well as the changes from the first episode to where I'm at now. So stay tuned for episode 3, which will be coming out on Black Friday, and that will actually have some gameplay with a couple minor changes from actually this week. All right, I hope you enjoy. Hello, we're ready to go off here, and part 2 of the Constructed Accumulated Knowledge. Going to be talking a lot about how I came up with the deck that we are focusing on this tournament, and it is the black-green, but I want to say it's the Delirium Marvel, and the Delirium concept kind of comes from Ishkanah Graph Widow, which I thought was good versus blue-white, and really Emrakul. And it's weird because Emrakul doesn't have actually Delirium on it, but the more cards you get into your graveyard, the easier it is to cast that. So before I get into any more with the deck, I want to start off this episode with how we arrived there. And in order to do that, I'm going to be using a lot of tabs for this week's episode. I wanted to start off with, here you go, Control Master himself. We got to go back. Shota Yasoka, the Pro Tour champ. So my first deck that was based off of the Marvel strategy was at the Pro Tour. As we're waiting for this to load, here, I played a different strategy of a Marvel deck, which consisted of 4 colors and was based off of the combo of Consulate Surveillance, which is a white enchantment that produces 4 energy, and you can pay 2 energy to prevent a source, and Madcap Experiment, which allows you to manipulate your library to get to an artifact and then take damage. So basically the concept, you play this, you prevent the damage from the Madcap, and you're only playing Aetherworks Marvel, so every time you're going to hit that. And I'd like to pull up the metagame here. So that was the first version of any of the Marvel decks that I came up with. Looking at these decks that were in the top 8, we have a pretty diverse field. If we start off with the 2 control decks, which not a lot of people expected at all, Carlos and Shota playing 2 different variations. Then we had a couple vehicle decks. They were a little bit different in their builds, and I won't need to really go into that, but this was like the #1 player going into it. It did well at the Star Cities before, and this was the known deck. Then we have decks like Blue-Red Spells and Mardu Vehicles, which were definitely different. Not a lot of people expected these decks either. And Blue-Red Spells has kind of went away after the Pro Tour. You don't see it as much, whereas Mardu Vehicles is lined up there right with Red-White Vehicles as pretty much the staple 3rd best deck in the format at this point. And then we have White-Blue Flash, which is arguably, the top 2 decks with Green-Black Delirium, which, did well in this tournament but didn't make the top 8. And we have a Temur Aetherworks deck that was played by Matthew Nass. So, looking at this top 8, I would think that moving forward, if we were basing the next tournament, which happened to be Grand Prix Providence, I did not want to play an Aetherworks Marvel deck based on the simple fact that there was a lot of control decks, and there was just a lot of blue decks in general. And the Marvel, as you can see here, I'll click on it. This was the version that Matt Nass played, and I played it, like I said, a different version. I didn't play blue for any main deck cards. It was for negates, and you could see contingency plans and things of that nature in this list. So this list doesn't really do that well toward like the counter spells and the control decks. So I don't think it would have been a good choice for Grand Prix Providence. And you could see that because when I'll go to it after this. We're talking about the Pro Tour. Let's go to Providence here. There was not a single copy of Aetherworks Marvel, I believe, on day 2. And just from my tournament report, I didn't see one on any of the tables. And I think it's a direct correlation to how well or how well the deck did at the Pro Tour to how well the decks that actually made it in the top 8. It was 20% of the meta, so getting one deck into the top 8 isn't really that exciting. Like, it's kind of a little below average, I think. But I think what happened was people knew that it's a thing now, and combo decks kind of lose a little bit when people know what's going on, first off. And then with as many decks that were popular that are bad matchups, I think a lot of people realized, okay, let's not do this. And let's actually play like a more conservative deck, which you could see. That Grand Prix winner here, Wang, played Black Green Delirium, and that was the deck pretty much of the tournament. So going from the Pro Tour, having like a Marvel shell that I kind of liked. Obviously, I played it. I went 6-4, and the deck's pretty variant. I could have won or lost a couple of those matches there, and could have had a little bit better of a record. Coming to Providence, where I played Grixis Control, I wasn't a big fan of the Marvel decks, and I'll run through this really quick. We have a lot of Green-Black Delirium. We have White-Blue Flash. And we have red-white vehicles. We have a ton of Black-Green Delirium. And a Black-Red Zombie player. So if I'm looking at this from a Marvel perspective, I'm looking at Black-Green Delirium decks as being like very good decks for an Aetherworks Marvel deck. I really, like, this tournament in itself might have been a decent tournament to play Marvel, just because people were playing Green-Black Delirium, and the top 8 metagame doesn't really reflect the entire tournament metagame. Because I could go a little deeper in here and show you that there was a lot of control in Providence. The Jeskai control deck was actually really popular. Grixis wasn't as popular. I did play one mirror match in Providence, and I saw a few people playing it, but the Jeskai version was definitely more popular. But the deck that I saw the most of, besides Black Green Delirium, and it's not a surprise, because if you look at the basically metagame now, in real life and on Moto, you'll see that White-Blue Flash is all over the place. It's a deck that I played once at the Pro Tour, and I was actually successful against my buddy Christian Kilcano, but it's a matchup where I don't want to play. They have Gideon, which is really hard to deal with. They have Spell Shrivels out of the board, Negates out of the board, Ceremonious Rejections out of the board, and the main card that it's hard to beat is Spell Queller. So with having like all of those cards against you, you don't want to play that deck a lot. And I didn't play Marvel Works because I knew through talking to teammates, good buddy Luis Salvato, and talking to some other people, getting the buzz, everyone knew that I think the best decks going into this tournament were going to be Black Green Delirium and White Blue Flash. And I want to highlight White Blue Flash because this is something that not a lot of people do. Is they look at the decks that not only top 8'd, but looking at the decks that actually perform the best, the 9-1 decks. And the White-Blue deck was 3 or 4 copies were 9-1. So in a diverse field, like having that kind of record is really something that stands out to me. So I guess where I'm going with this is looking at the top 8 doesn't really constitute exactly what you should be building your deck around. You need to look a little deeper than that and do more than just, oh, well, the deck's not in the top 8, it's not a good deck. Or look at all these decks in the top 8, maybe I should just play that deck as well. So you don't want to read too much into that because there's a lot of decks that were on the precipice of just one win or, picking up one bad draw of being in the top 8, and this could be definitely changed. So after this tournament, I started working on a Marvel deck that was a Bant Marvel deck. Basically, the only matchup that I was really worried about was the White-Blue deck. And I can pull it up here just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. The Gideons, the Copters, the Stasis Snares, and the Reflector Mages. So a concept I came up with that I thought was pretty keen was to just run my Aetherworks Marvel right into their Spell Queller. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this. And I started doing it online. It worked okay because in the Bant version, I had 4 Reflector Mages. So not only are they a good card just against like creature decks because it'll just set them off and you can like bounce one and block one, which is obviously the Mana War effect is really strong. But being able to Reflector Mage your opponent's Spell Queller, they have to have a second spell queller to punish you, and if they don't, you're going to be able to return the spell queller and then resolve the Aetherworks Marvel, at least in game 1. You know, you see 1 negate here, but you can see I'm talking about the negates in the sideboard, the ceremonious rejections, summary dismissals even. So there's a lot of, you know, hate for this kind of strategy. And like summary dismissals like overlapping. Like it's meant for the black-green Delirium decks, but you know, the longer the game goes, you get to a point of actually hard casting Emrakul, which is what black-green does, but that hurts, you know, the Marvel builds as well. So I tried that for a while, and I was trying Reflector Mage with Elder Deep Fiend, being able to like, okay, I'll return their Queller, and then when I want to actually go off, I could sack the Reflector Mage to the Elder Deep Fiend and tap their lands down, because that'll shut their, you know, counter spells off. It'll shut their mana. But it didn't end up panning out too much. So I kind of like decided, how am I going to actually beat these decks while still being able to beat the other decks? And before I get into the build that I basically played in the first part of the series, I want to get into where the meta's at. So after Grand Prix Providence, let me pull back here real quick, sorry. We had Warsaw and Santiago. These tournaments basically are the heart of the meta game leading into the tournament that we're doing this series for, which is GP Denver. So we have, real quickly, I guess, I'll go through Warsaw. Here we go. Warsaw, where we see a ton of yet black-green Delirium and white-blue Flash again. And keeps to be sneaking in there as an aggro deck, whether it's vehicles, in this case it happens to be red-black aggro. And then I want to get into Santiago. And you'll see yet again a bunch of black-green Delirium. And in this case, there's a couple other decks. There's white-blue Flash that won it. And we have a couple outliers. We have like blue-red Colossus, blue-red Fevered Visions, and we have Mardu vehicles. And what I want to like emphasize here is you just keep seeing like, yes, there's 1 or 2 decks that maybe you didn't expect to be in there, but you're seeing these black-green Delirium, blue-white Flash, blue-white Flash. So it's kind of driving the point home that these 2 decks are the main decks you need to prepare for. So this is the like level 0, I guess, of preparing for a tournament. Looking at the real life metagame, which are those 2 tournaments are going to be the best kind of information you can gather to look at. And then also utilizing your resources with MTGO. And Goldfish is a great site where a lot of people go. They get a lot of information from, so I do suggest using it. And you can look right here and see that 25%, 26% of the meta has been white-blue Flash, and this kind of updates, I think, daily, and 22.65% is black-green Delirium. Now, in the last week, this is kind of like flipped-flopped. It used to be black-green Delirium by a couple percent over white-blue Flash, and you can kind of see that like a lot of people, I believe, are just preparing for these decks because they know how well they are doing. But yet they're still putting up the numbers, which goes to how strong these decks actually are. Working down a little further here, we talked about the vehicle decks as being like the 3rd best player, whether it's Mardu or red-white. And you can kind of see that here. We have 8%. We have black-red aggro, which has been picking up a little bit. You saw the 1 copy in Warsaw's top 8, Andreas Gantz at 6%. And then this deck right here. So green-red Aetherworks Marvel. It's made popular by a known streamer, Jabberwockies. I actually watched a little bit of his stream last night. And it is a Marvel deck that has basically decided not to go as big and is playing cards like World Breaker, Ishkana, Chandra Flamecaller, and other things to not just go all in on traditional Marvel decks that have had 7 to 8 real huge Ulamog and Emrakul hits. Because I think that this is just how the meta is changing to try to beat some of the other decks like White Blue Flash, and realizing that maybe you don't need to go as combo oriented and we can play like a more fair game with the Marvel. scrolling down here, we're going to start to see some lower percentage decks like the Zombie decks, Dynavolt deck. We have another Aetherworks Marvel deck. And then we have the control decks I talked about and some Pummeler stuff. And we don't need to get into all of those, but they are decks that should be on your radar. So first step, level 0, looking at the top 3 decks. One of the things that I always do going into a tournament, Modern's kind of tough to do at this point because it's like there's so many decks. But Standard, you can still do this. I look at the top 3 decks, and the percentages here are actually really significant to how much like you're going to see this deck. And if my deck that I'm playing doesn't have a good matchup versus 2 of the 3 decks, then I should not be playing that deck. And that's definitely like level 0 where you should look at that and be like, oh, well, Black-Green Delirium's great, and Marduk's not bad, but it's not good. Like, I think you should be trying to find a deck that can actually beat these 2 of the 3 decks consistently. Because most problems with a deck, like White-Blue Flash happens to be a problem for our build, the Marvels, we actually can sideboard a little bit to make that more of a 50-50 closer matchup. Because as you see, it's 25% of the meta. But that statistic isn't always going to be true for real-life metagames, as well as, just the variance of the pairings that is at a Grand Prix. In a 16-round tournament, you could play the deck 5 times if it's 25% of the meta, but you could also just play it once. There's been many tournaments that I've gone to, and, I can look back a long time ago to Grand Prix Phoenix, where Mono Black was the deck. It was Pack Rat, Thoughtseize, and I only played it twice in the entire tournament, and that was one of the more dominant decks in Standard since I've been playing Magic professionally now. And so that just goes to show you that, yes, you want to be prepared for the decks, but don't always just think like, man, I need to have 10 sideboard cards to beat White-Blue Flash because I beat the other 2 decks, but I want to be able to smash that, and then maybe you're going to lose to decks like the Zombies because you could have had like 1 or 2 cards for them that were, carried over to some other matchups. So that's definitely something I wanted to, touch base on. So now that I've kind of went over how I, pick apart the metagame and looking at the previous tournaments, looking at the MTGO metagame, I want to start now to show you the list for those that didn't see episode 1. This is the list plus 1 select for inspection, which I tried, and I think one of the cards I cut was Aether Meltdown, I believe. So this is a list that we played through the first part, as well as I've been testing for a while. Key points that I liked was the Grasp of Darknesses are very good versus the Grimflayers, the Tireless Trackers, which you're seeing some more play now, as well as getting rid of Spell Queller and Avacyn, and that kind of thing is something that I really wanted to be able to do because White-Blue and Black-Green are 2 very popular decks. And Demon of the Dark Schemes, the 5/5 flyer for 6, was something that I wanted to test out because it's very good versus aggressive matchups and it also can grind really good. Gearhulk kind of falls along the same lines as that. It's one of those cards where if you're playing with Traverse the Uvenwald, having bullets, like that to search for, they're really strong. So one of the things that I was doing with this deck was trying to figure out what I believe to be the metagame and have a sideboard plan based on what that is going to, entail. So we talked about White-Blue enough, we talked about Black-Green, and we talked about the Vehicles decks. So you can see that I have different cards here for those matchups, but I want to get into a card like Ceremonious Rejection, which doesn't really fit into any of those. You can make an argument against Vehicles if they're playing Mardu Vehicles, because then they have Transgress. And it's just a card that when you're playing a card like Ceremonious Rejection, you want to have specific hits for it. And so as you might think it's like a good card to bring in versus Mardu Vehicles, or regular like a black-red aggro or something like that, the only card that I really want to hit with Ceremonious Rejection is Transgress the Mind. More times than not, the decks are going to be able to you're going to be able to get your Marvel out and get enough energy to kill them before they can kill you. The only disruption spell that they really have is Transgress the Mind. So being able to be a turn slower, where you can like fetch the land, the island out, or you have Aether Hub, and just being able to stop them from getting the information and taking your Marvel. The decks just don't have a lot of ways to deal with Marvel once it's resolved, and you pretty much can, the writing's on the wall if it does resolve. So utilization of your sideboard cards is very important thing, as well as knowing what they're in there for. The natural states, they're in there for the stasis snares, they're in there for the keys of the city, all the things that I want to like just smash out of the wall. Whereas the ceremonious rejections have very specific targets. Flailing Tendrils, pretty self-explanatory. That's there for the fast aggressive decks. More Grasps, that has to do with the white-blue deck. I want to be able to kill Spell Quellers and Avacins and as much as possible. And we tried a couple different things here. We tried having the one dead weight, which is good for Delirium. Helps us activate that versus the aggressive decks. The one select for inspection, I tried for Gideon specifically. And yeah, you're like, oh, well, one copy, that's probably not anything, that's going to matter. And you're right, like one copy doesn't really give us a lot of, play for that card. But it's also like a card that is, with having one copy, I don't think our opponents are going to be able to play around that. And I wanted to just give it a couple games and see how, it did. Maybe I should have put 2 or 3 in there just to test the card. I didn't actually get to play it too much, so we didn't get to see it in action. And the last card I just wanted to talk about, I guess, is Gonti, Lord of the Luxury. It's a card that I've liked since it's came out, and I still like it versus Black-Green Delirium and some of the other mid-range decks, because it's a time buyer, For 4 mana, 2/3 Death Touch, sure, not great. But being able to grab a card from your opponent's deck and they don't know what's going on, like with it, there's been games where I've literally took my opponent's Emrakul after they've lost Legacied me, and they just played in a way where they couldn't get wrecked by Emrakul because they knew that I couldn't play it. And I just had it there and waited and just played it, and they just conceded. It was pretty cool. So that's a card that I wanted to try out versus those decks, because with Black-Green being a good matchup, you still sometimes want to have cards that improve after sideboard, because they're going to be improving. If it's their worst matchup, I guarantee you they're going to have a card or two for it, because that's just the way that it works. So this was the initial build, and we're going to get into where I'm actually at now. So I mentioned that I was watching Jabberwocky's stream, and I was trying to learn as much as I could about the way his Marvel deck works. For those of you that don't know, it's the green-red Marvel Works deck. He just won the standard constructed online tournament this previous weekend. I don't know if I'm saying that exactly right. And so it kind of caught my eye. It was a deck that I've been playing around online with and against. And I was like, you know what? I want to give this a shot to just watch the way that it works and maybe take a few of the principles that he's using and kind of carry it over. So, boom. This is the version that I came up with by utilizing some of what he's doing. One of the cards that I remember on stream, I'll bring these 2 cards over here, that he was talking really highly of, was Chandra, Torch of Defiance, and Harness Lightning. So, I'm a big fan of Chandra. I've been a big fan of Chandra since it came out. Harness Lightning is kind of filling the role in this deck as a Grasp of Darkness. And I didn't like it at first because I don't want to count on my Harness Lightning to be an energy producer, because it's a removal spell that's going to be utilizing energy. Utilizing the fact that you've built some energy up and maybe you can get things that aren't 3 damage. Like Avacyn, for instance. But I was looking at it and I was like, well, I have Grasp in there, and essentially it's doing the same thing, but it's easier on the mana, and it can actually just, if I need a Dark Ritual for Marvel, it does that. And a lot of times, I'm going to have extra energy laying around, so I think I want to give it a shot. And Chandra, I don't really need to speak too much of Chandra. The card's just, in a vacuum, it's just phenomenal. And seeing how Jabberwocky's deck was working, it was just something that I believe this deck was missing, was a way to kill a creature right away, like a Grim Flare, things of that nature. Whereas they maybe Reflector Mage your Servant. Now you could stick a Chandra, kill the Reflector Mage, and then start ticking up. And one of the ways that I definitely lose is from two things. One, not having enough card draw, and the first part of the combo got broken up, maybe through hand destruction or maybe just through the variance of this deck, because there's a lot of searching, cycling, scrying, and also because of Ishkana. You see I only have one now, and I may put the second one back in. I want to try just doing the one, and I've cut an Ulamog. But there's been a lot of times where I have got to 3 cards in my graveyard for Delirium, and I'm missing the one card, but I need to play Ishkana because I need to get a creature on the board. And so with adding Harness and Chandra, we're adding 2 types that the deck didn't produce otherwise. Only having 2 grasps, you can't really count on the instance. And now I think with 4 copies, I think it's more realistic that we can get there. And the Chandra is a card where, yes, if you mill it, it's going to get in there, sure, from the Vessel. But if you play it, you're either winning the game because it's still on the table, or they've killed it, and now you have 1 more Delirium, which means Ishkana's, more live, and Emrakul's a turn faster, whether from the mana it's producing or just from it dying. So I really like that. Excuse me one sec. Getting into the sideboard, how it's changed here. The mana was real easy. So we have the Kozilek's Returns. We still have Ceremonious Rejections and the Natural States, but we've went a little bit bigger with Nissas and World Breakers. World Breaker and Nissas. I like both of these cards. With having Traverse, I explained the bullet concept. I really like World Breaker a lot now. It's just one of those cards where the cast trigger is great. Being able to maybe even in the mirror bringing it in, having Ceremonious and World Breaker, it's really strong. Nissa, I'm trying out. I want to bring it in against white-blue Flash on the play, as well as some of the grindier matchups like black-green. I think it's a card that comes in versus both. And I can follow up a Gideon play by being able to activate a 5/5, and killing Gideon after the turn. So, a lot of times they play Gideon, make a 2/2, and then sometimes a turn after that, if they don't have Avacyn, you're going to kill it. And if you just land Nissa and just attack them, it's not the worst possible thing in the world, because you're going to attack them, they're going to chump block with their token, and even if they activate their Gideon, the Gideon can only do 5 damage to Nissa, and Nissa will kill on the swing back if they don't have a creature. So I think it's interesting, and it gets around Spell Queller, which I like. And then the last card, Tireless Tracker. There's been a resurgence of this card lately. I think a lot of decks have realized, well, this card's still here, and it's really good. And it's just one of those cards when you're on the play versus decks like Spell Queller, like the white-blue Flash decks that have Spell Queller. You just play this card, and if it doesn't die, you're just getting so much value, and it just kind of changes the way the role of your deck works. So this strategy is a little bit different. I've seen black-green Delirium decks versus the Marvel matchup just try to get as aggressive as possible and kill you before you can accumulate enough energy and activate the Marvel. So it's another card, with that being Tireless Tracker, that I want to bring in versus white-blue Flash on the play and make them have to make the decision to Reflector Mage my Tireless Tracker on turn 3, and then if I have the Marvel, I can resolve it, and that really puts a lot of weight on them having Fragmentize in their sideboard and also bringing it in and having it at that time. And if they don't get rid of the tracker, you're just going to be accumulating some incremental board advantage with getting the clues, so that's kind of where I'm at with that. So this is kind of the changes I've made. I've yet to play a game with it, and we're going to play a couple games today, so I'm pretty excited about that. It is a lot different than the black-green Marvel version, so I guess different in the sense that we have a little bit less explosiveness. I think the Harness Lightnings will show their worth, and hopefully Chandra's going to be able to see some play. I'm really interested in some of the decisions I'm going to be forced to make. with the sideboard, and we'll kind of get into that. I think there was one other thing I wanted to touch on real quick with the metagame. Is remember what I said before we get into the actual gameplay for the rest of this episode, is remember that these decks are what you're going to be playing for the most part, having like proper plans for each matchup. So looking at all these decks now, the main three we have here, and I guess you could tie red-white vehicles in here, and I would really like look at most of the matchups, even as far down as like green-red energy, as like viable decks that you're going to see at a Grand Prix level. And so one of the biggest things I think that should be done, and I will get around to doing that the closer we get to the tournament, is looking at the cards that we're bringing in for certain matchups to the cards we're bringing out. I think a lot of people baseline it and go, oh yes, they're playing white-red vehicles, or they're playing black-red aggro. I want all the Kozilek's returns I can fit into my deck. I want all the natural states I can fit in my deck. And let's just use that for an example, right? So there's 6 cards that I'm bringing in. I need to make sure that I have 6 cards that I want to take out, because this is getting into the utilization of our actual sideboard cards. And this is where sideboarding becomes very complex, and a lot of people want to just have these cards because they're so good versus this matchup. But you'll see the masters of sideboarding and the masters of deck building will actually find the best way of getting a Swiss Army knife effect out of every card they have in their sideboard. So I just want to kind of explain the fact that this is the surface that we're scratching, because we're still 2 weeks out from the tournament, and I have a large number of a lot of these cards because I want to actually see them in play and the in-game actual capability of these cards. However, when we get closer, you may see some of them getting shaved and getting cards that are just like carryover from like 2 or 3 different matchups, like Natural State, for instance. I bring in versus white-blue, and I bring in versus the vehicles decks and the red-black aggro decks. So it's actually a very good card. And I guess one of the decks to the Colossus deck, it comes in as well. And it's just one of those cards where this is one of the cards where I don't think I'm going to take a single copy out, because it just is across the board an all-star versus those matchups. But cards like Nissa and Worldbreaker, I want to know my specific matchups I'm bringing those cards in for, my specific targets for the Worldbreaker, my specific role Nissa's playing into this matchup. Is Nissa going to be the beatdown? Is it going to be the 5/5 that I can race Gideon with, like I alluded to? Is it going to be the, we're going to try to get to the emblem because we know like how many times this deck can flood out, and just being able to play lands and draw cards is where we want to be? Or is this going to fill the role of regrowth? Hey, we'll put it out. We'll put a 5/5 out and defend. And then next turn, we're going to try to buy back a Chandra or a Marvel Works that has been fragmentized. These are the things that that go through my mind, and I think are very important, that not a lot of people take enough time to actually think about and work toward getting the best bang for their buck, per se, out of every card in their sideboard.
People of Kaladesh, whether you hail from distant fields or greenbelt towns or from our great city centers, this is your time. The Kaladesh Inventors Fair invites you, our best and brightest, to share your ingenuity with the world. As an official entrant, you may fuel your creativity with unrestricted ether access. Demonstrate that you can channel the ether into bold, new creations. Showcase your ideas, your inventions, your genius. In this time when anything is buildable, you can invent your tomorrow